So it is with great pleasure and happiness that I want to ask Anita to come and speak here today.
Can I just check this is on? Can you all hear me? I can't see you, so you'll have to let me know. All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you so much to Provost Reinisch, to Dr. Goswami, to the leadership team for giving me this invitation to join you for the first inaugural George Floyd Symposium. Before I begin, I want to recall the name of the man whose memory is being honored here today. This is a man whose name resonates with the unspoken names of all of those who have lost their lives to ignorance and hatred. It's a name that has inspired a multiracial movement to assert the equal worth of Black lives, and one that guides a new generation's efforts to confront a history built on division in order to build a new future together. And that name is George Floyd. Today's symposium brings us together to think about a broad range of perspectives on social justice. But this event is also at its heart an opportunity for us to reflect on the life and death of a man who died too soon because his skin was Black. I feel an obligation to say something to you that will help us make sense of that. I also know that my skin is white. I have never been demeaned or excluded or endangered because of my skin. And there are limits to what I can ever know about this particularly horrific form of social injustice. But I will try to draw upon my own professional and personal experiences and identities. As a historian, and as a first-generation student who grew up in poverty, as an immigrant, and as a bicultural Latina who called 3 countries home before the age of 30, as a military wife, and as a committed Catholic, as an advocate for educational and immigrants' rights, I will try to add something to what you've already learned here today. The title of the talk that I've prepared for you today is Small Justice, Embodying Change in Our Daily Lives. And a little later I'll tell you what I mean by the term small justice. But first, what is social justice? Today you've heard multiple discussions of the term, but I'd like us to begin by thinking about its multiple origins and meanings, and because I'm a historian, about its place in our history. The Oxford Dictionary defines social justice as the fair distribution of wealth and opportunities within a society. More broadly, as a concept, social justice has deep roots in African, Asian, and indigenous cultures, past and present, in European Enlightenment philosophy and Catholic teaching dating back to the mid-1800s. Social justice as an idea is also present in other major religious traditions, including Judaism and Islam. Here in the US, the values of social justice have wide and deep roots. They inspired the leaders of the anti-slavery, suffragist, and juvenile justice reform movements of the 19th century, as well as the long African-American civil rights movement of the 20th century. And since World War I, social justice has been the driving force behind popular demands for government reforms, of which white working-class Americans have been the major recipients. These include post-war legislation establishing an 8-hour workday, Depression-era legislation that established minimum wages for industrial and commercial workers. However, minimum wage laws exempted the agricultural sector, which after the end of slavery became increasingly dominated by first Asian and then Mexican immigrant and then Mexican-American laborers. The values of social justice also inspired the creation of Social Security pensions during the Great Depression, and the innovation of federally insured mortgages, which made working-class homeownership possible for the first time in US history in the 1930s. Although again, this new privilege, which we've come to see as symbolic of the American dream, but is in fact a relatively new thing, was limited almost exclusively to white families until the late 1960s. The same, unfortunately, was true of the GI Bill, which made a college education accessible for the first time to a new generation of working-class military veterans, but which was also initially restricted mostly to white veterans. Now, since the 1960s, thanks to decades of activism by Black, Latinx, Asian, and Native Americans, the notion of social justice has increasingly inspired legislation and programs that have begun to address the harmful legacy of racial inequality in our nation. These begin with Lyndon Johnson's Great Society legislation in the mid-1960s, which not only funded the Federal Food Stamps Act and job creation and training programs in the desperately poor and mostly white Appalachian Mountain region, but also enshrined voting rights for all and prohibited racial discrimination in housing and employment. Since then, ever more diverse forms of social justice activism, from the movement for equal pay to efforts to secure a path to citizenship for undocumented youth, and to allow gay, lesbian, and transgender people to serve in the military, continue today. Now, despite this diversity, there's something that unites all of these efforts, and that is the desire of all people to enjoy freedom, safety, dignity, and opportunity. And as these few examples I've chosen make clear, social justice isn't just about race. Poverty and suffering come in many colors. Inequality and exclusion take their toll on young and old, gay and straight, male, female, and non-binary, disabled and non-disabled people. Injustice occurs in urban and rural, and in liberal and conservative communities. But I've learned from studying history that it's impossible for us to talk honestly about poverty or unemployment or inadequate health care or failing public schools, things that hurt Americans of all backgrounds, without acknowledging that long ingrained patterns of racialized inequality make those things worse for people of color. So to recap, social justice does not mean special treatment for minorities, at least not in the simplistic way that this term is often used. When we invest our collective time and effort and money in improving the life chances of marginalized groups, it isn't because they are inherently virtuous or entitled to extra privileges. It's because we believe in fairness. We know that life is often unfair. And because of that, we realize that treating everyone the same isn't always fair. In an unjust world, special help is sometimes required to level the playing field or to mitigate the harm of past injustice. For example, when we give free school lunches to low-income children of all races, it's not to give them something extra or to take something away from their better-off classmates, but rather to ensure that those who don't have food at home also get to eat at lunchtime. Something that children from more financially secure homes have the privilege of taking for granted. Social justice-inspired movements today, whether in the name of marriage equality or police reform, strive to do the same thing. They aren't about pitting communities against one another. They are efforts to ensure that everyone benefits from the rights and freedoms that are so central to what we imagine America to be. They are about making sure that everyone gets to eat at lunchtime. And I think that deep down, most of us want everyone to be included at the lunch table. We would like to be citizens of a nation that treats everyone fairly. But some of us maybe get overwhelmed by the magnitude and the complexity of the suffering around us, and we don't know how to start. Others worry that improving our social safety net will cause taxes to skyrocket. Others are secretly afraid that justice for others will require them to give up privileges that they've come to see as rights. We might think that the cost of social justice will be too great. And so what do? We close our eyes to injustice, or we cling to beliefs that comfort us by explaining away the suffering that we can't help but see. We insist that people who are poor because they are morally or racially deficient, and that only people who are like us deserve help and understanding. But speaking to you now, not as a scholar, but as a person, I have to say that I think there might be an even higher price to pay for maintaining an unjust status quo. And I think that as a nation, we're paying it. Let's be real, people. We're angry, and we're divided, and we're afraid of one another. We're missing out on one another's warmth and wisdom and beauty, on all of the music and the art and the food and the families that we could make together. We are squandering the vast potential of today's generations and endangering the generations to come. We're wasting our lifeblood on futile efforts to hold on to the past, on assigning and avoiding blame. And I think maybe we'd all be better off if we could redirect all of that anger and all of that wasted energy towards knowing and caring for one another, towards working to build a more just future. But how? As a scholar, my answer is that change requires collective action, including a government commitment to dismantling and rebuilding macro-level structures and institutions that prevent people from being treated fairly. But social justice isn't just an intellectual problem, and we don't just live our lives in macro-level structures and institutions. Nor is injustice something that happens somewhere else to other people. When we narrow our gaze, we see how it operates close to home, in our relationships and workplaces, our classrooms, and our neighborhoods. Regardless of our identities, as Dr. Kroon said this morning, we have all experienced injustice, and we have all participated in perpetuating it. But as Dr. Kroon also said, on the flip side, we can also all participate in combating it. The ways that we live and work, our relationships with our children, with our elders, with our neighbors, and maybe especially with strangers, are all places where we can choose to practice what I call small justice. So here's a few ideas for you. First, for those of you who are students, keep doing what you're doing. Educate yourselves. Don't just read, but learn how to identify sources that are credible and challenging. Engage in intelligent, respectful, and uncomfortable discussions with your families and community members, especially people who are different from you, and especially those who disagree with you. Practice the lost art of civil debate that is so essential to democracy. Second, we can approach our workplace and our classrooms as a place for social justice. We can do our job or our studies in the most ethical and just way. We can stand up for others who are mistreated. We can demand changes that prevent people from being harassed or exploited in our workplaces or classrooms. We can remember the people who are longing for their own opportunity to study or work and try to find ways to open the doors to employment and education for others. We can volunteer. We can do the quiet, uncompensated, and often unexciting work of gathering clothes or serving food at a shelter or serving on a committee to rewrite an outdated campus policy. We can walk with others. In Latin American Catholic liberation theology, this is known as acompañamiento, accompaniment. In its simplest terms, this means deliberately putting yourself in places where you spend time with people who are in need and who are different from you. Listen to them without judging. Try to know and understand their experiences. Accompanying others allows us to learn where and when we can help in meaningful, substantive ways, rather than assuming in advance that we know what people need. But equally important, acompañamiento, accompaniment, can transform the way we see our world and our place in it. Unlike sympathy, which sees other people's suffering as distant and separate from us, acompañamiento builds our empathy, which allows us to simultaneously acknowledge the distinctiveness of our own experience while remembering that we are all connected. We can remember that the work of social justice is not just about denouncing injustice, but also about doing the work to create the conditions for justice. Now, this is something that many faith traditions understand. The Hindu goddess Kali is simultaneously a goddess of destruction and creation. And as the Bible says in Ephesians, there's a time to tear down and a time to build. We can advance the cause of social justice by creating. We can build things together. We can be sensitive and respectful in our interpersonal relationships, in our communities, and in our homes. We can remember that words and actions have the potential to protect dignity or to strip it away. We can choose not to make fun of people's accents, or their appearance, or their culture. We can choose not to stereotype and demean people who don't share our politics. And when we hurt one another, we can apologize and make things right. As individuals and as a nation, we can remember that admitting our failures doesn't take anything away from us. In fact, as our faith traditions teach, the act of acknowledging when we've harmed others and making amends actually heals and restores our dignity as well. Finally, we can vote like grown-ups. Instead of treating the ballot box like an instrument for advancing our own interests and loyalties or as a way to punish other people, let's take seriously our obligation to vote intelligently and ethically. We can take the time to responsibly study the issues and the candidates, to consult credible and varied sources, and to prioritize the common good. These are some of the many ways that each of us can choose to practice small justice. Now, I am not suggesting that all of our problems can be solved strictly through individual transformation and action. Small justice alone will not combat the enduring forms of injustice that are embedded in our laws and social structures, but nor can we legislate our way out of ignorance and hatred and exclusion. What I'm suggesting today is that we not take an either-or approach to the pursuit of social justice. Let's take an and approach. In the same way that the most innovative scholars of my discipline in history have challenged the distinction between what is public and what is private, let's remember that our individual lives and the lives of our community and our nation are interwoven. Let's remember, as Martin Luther King said in his 1963 letter from the Birmingham jail, that we are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Small justice is not an alternative to broader political and social engagement, but rather a necessary complement to these things. It's an acknowledgement that even as we work to dismantle and rebuild unjust structures, we also need to work on ourselves. We need to embody justice at all levels. And when you think about it like that, perhaps small justice isn't so small after all. Thank you.